Among all literary paradigms, the antagonist stands out as the most deeply fascinating and compelling figure you will ever encounter. While audiences are intimately familiar with the noble, self-sacrificing protagonist who bravely faces terrifying trials, this beacon of virtue invariably steals the narrative focus. Yet, this champion could never truly materialize without an essential antithesis. The adversary lurks in the obscurity, serving as a perfect manifestation of the champion's shadow, embodying all those suppressed, concealed, and mysterious traits. Ultimately, these dark figures mirror those hidden facets of your own psyche that you hesitate to face or admit, despite their universal presence within human nature. Individuals endowed with immense potential often suffer devastating defeats against their internal struggles, transforming into corrupted or fallen champions who seamlessly transition into malevolent roles. Conversely, hesitant protagonists harbor greatness but struggle with deep-seated insecurities, whereas tragic figures strive for righteousness but are ultimately undone by personal flaws or profound misfortune. The ancient philosopher Aristotle defined tragedy through the concept of poetic mimesis, portraying scenarios based on potential reality rather than strict factual existence. The fundamental objective behind such dramatic works is to trigger a powerful catharsis, purifying the spectators as they project themselves into the turbulent emotional landscapes of imaginary personas. By deliberately evoking profound sorrow and terror, theatrical tragedies cleanse you of these very burdens, acting as a profound psychological remedy, and similarly, exploring malicious characters allows you to safely grapple with the inherent darkness and terrors buried deep within your own mind. Tracing its linguistic roots, the term villain originates from the medieval Latin designation villanus, initially describing a simple peasant or farm laborer bound to agrarian existence and a lower societal tier. As the vocabulary passed into Old French, it preserved this agrarian connection while gradually accumulating dark implications regarding a person's ethical substance, eventually morphing to define the primary adversarial force that generates the crucial friction necessary for a protagonist's journey. A narrative's quality is frequently measured by the caliber of its antagonist, as a formidable adversary compels the champion to elevate their abilities, meaning that lacking a substantial threat renders any tale stagnant and uninspiring. These foes consistently prove themselves as imposing equals, frequently surpassing the protagonist in raw power. Adversaries manifest in countless varied forms, with their earliest ancestors taking the shape of primal, untamed agents of chaos that inflict devastation completely detached from any ethical framework. Such antagonistic energies constantly threaten to dismantle civilized order, appearing throughout folklore as terrifying beasts, mythological dragons, and ferocious creatures driven purely by basic urges. According to the theories of Sigmund Freud, these entities completely lack a superego, meaning they operate without the societal regulations and ethical compasses that normally dictate human morality and ensure communal harmony. Widely recognized as a foundational pillar of written language, the Epic of Gilgamesh draws upon ancient Sumerian myths and was likely composed between the years 2100 and 2000 BC. Within this ancient narrative, the titular champion initially rules with an iron fist, prompting the divine pantheon to dispatch the untamed Enkidu to temper his arrogance, though the two surprisingly forge a deep brotherhood. Together, they journey to challenge Humbaba, the terrifying supernatural protector stationed at the divine sanctuary known as the Cedar Forest. But their eventual triumph over this beast incites intense divine fury. The conflict escalates when the companions slaughter the Bull of Heaven, a devastating creature deployed against them by Ishtar, the revered deity commanding domains of affection, combat, and abundance. Consequent to this blasphemous act, the Divine Council sentences Enkidu to an early demise, perfectly illustrating the tragic archetype of the prematurely fallen champion. This devastating loss shatters Gilgamesh, plunging him into absolute despair and igniting a profound existential terror that ultimately drives his desperate quest to uncover the secret of eternal life. Composed during the 8th century BC, Homer's monumental Greek saga, the Odyssey, features a tenth sequence where Odysseus and his crew infiltrate the cavern of the monstrous Cyclops Polyphemus, brazenly consuming his provisions during his absence. Rather than fleeing immediately, the protagonist stubbornly insists on lingering to demand customary hospitality gifts, a disastrous decision that results in the enraged giant returning to devour several crew members. Through brilliant cunning, the commander successfully blinds the beast while claiming his name is Nobody, brilliantly sabotaging the monster's cries for rescue. Yet, in a fatal display of hubris during their escape, he arrogantly shouts his true identity, securing a devastating curse from the ocean god Poseidon. Early mythologies heavily prioritize the grand expedition itself, rather than deeply analyzing the specific moral compass of the protagonist, or the varied adversaries encountered along the way, often presenting a deeply flawed central figure instead of utilizing a distinct, unmistakable antagonist. Conversely, later medieval traditions introduce much clearer adversarial forces, beautifully exemplified by the Old English masterpiece Beowulf, written somewhere between the years 700 and 1000 AD. This epic details the horrific reign of Grendel, a grotesque beast driven by an agonizing envy of human joy, who massacres the revelers at the Heorot Mead Hall for over a decade, before the legendary Geatish warrior finally arrives to rip the monster apart without the aid of any weaponry. The narrative explicitly traces Grendel's vile lineage back to Cain, recognized within the Old Testament as the eldest offspring of Adam and Eve, who committed history's first homicide by slaughtering his brother Abel in a blind rage, thereby earning eternal exile. As literature advanced, the psychological depth of these antagonists expanded drastically. For example, within the early 15th century tragedy Othello, the legendary playwright Shakespeare provides an unprecedented, masterful dissection of pure malice through the deeply manipulative machinations of the treacherous Iago. Serving as Othello's trusted confidant, this master of deception meticulously orchestrates the ruin of his commander by weaponizing his deepest anxieties. Through calculated manipulation, he cultivates overwhelming jealousy and suspicion, which ultimately results in a cascade of fatal tragedies. Yet the most profound blueprint for the antagonist is likely Lucifer, once the most cherished and luminous of celestial beings, whose divine insurrection resulted in his banishment from heaven to become the ultimate embodiment of malevolence. This fallen entity manifests as the serpent within the Garden of Eden, seducing early humanity into a fateful display of hubris that triggers their initial defiance and subsequent expulsion from paradise. John Milton, within his 1667 epic Paradise Lost, frames Satan with fascinating ambiguity, portraying his divine uprising as an unyielding quest for autonomy rather than mere wickedness, driven by a staunch rejection of perceived heavenly dictatorship. The fallen angel profoundly asserts that ruling over an underworld is vastly superior to subjugation in a celestial realm. Moving to the early 19th century, Goethe's Faust introduces Mephistopheles, a demonic force materializing during the protagonist's darkest psychological crisis. This fiend presents a gruesome proposition sealed in blood, promising boundless worldly delights at the steep cost of eternal damnation. Despite harboring deep skepticism, the scholar agrees to these terms, an act that perfectly encapsulates the alluring pull of malevolence. Nevertheless, the protagonist remains deeply committed to righteous pursuits, dedicating his efforts to uplifting his community rather than indulging endlessly in sin. Although he briefly tastes profound euphoria, his consistent moral endeavors ensure his ultimate spiritual redemption. Paradoxically, it is the relentless demonic pressure, coupled with the scholar's resilient defiance that paves the way for his heavenly deliverance. In Mary Shelley's 1818 masterpiece, Frankenstein, we witness the brilliant, yet unhinged, Victor Frankenstein successfully bringing stitched corpses to life, only to flee in sheer terror from his own sentient fabrication. Left entirely to his own devices, this forsaken being equates his miserable existence to the outcast Lucifer found in Paradise Lost. The wanderer struggles to comprehend his creator's severe rejection and the intense hatred he faces from a terrified civilization. Upon catching a glimpse of his own grotesque visage in a body of water, he is struck by the same visceral revulsion that plagues the humans who cross his path. Seeking connection, the lonely entity develops a deep affection for an impoverished household, quietly carrying out benevolent chores from the shadows to ease their burdens. However, when he finally steps into the light to seek their companionship, he is met with violent hostility and forced into a desperate retreat. This devastating betrayal extinguishes his final flickers of optimism regarding societal integration, igniting a furious, murderous rampage fueled by relentless persecution. Such a heartbreaking trajectory perfectly illustrates the archetype of the deeply tragic antagonist. Bram Stoker's 1897 Gothic thriller Dracula presents a quintessential blueprint for the literary monster. The titular fiend utilizes his otherworldly abilities to hunt defenseless victims, spreading his vampiric curse through the grim exchange of blood and fatal bites, until Professor Van Helsing leads a determined expedition into Transylvania to finally vanquish him. Shifting to the mid-20th century, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings thrusts its central champion, Frodo Baggins, into a profound ethical conflict concerning Gollum, a miserable creature widely perceived as a wretched foe. Originally a simple being named Smeagol, his soul was utterly warped by the One Ring, an artifact containing the overwhelming malice of Sauron, demonstrating how easily absolute power can rot the spirit of its bearer. This corrupted entity's sole reason for living becomes intertwined with that cursed jewelry, serving as a potent metaphor for humanity's innate vulnerability to avarice, vanity, and moral decay. While traversing the treacherous landscapes of Middle-earth to annihilate this artifact, Frodo Baggins is guided by this very monster. Upon standing at the fiery edge of Mount Doom, the designated site for the object's unmaking, the hero experiences a paralyzing moment of doubt. The protagonist clearly sees the terrifying similarities between his guide's tragic descent and his own agonizing psychological burden, realizing they share the identical weight of dark temptation. Choosing to spare his wretched companion is a deliberate attempt to reject the creeping shadows and preserve his own fragile humanity, right before he shockingly claims the prize for himself. In a desperate counterattack, the fallen creature severs the protagonist's finger to reclaim the treasure, only to stumble and plummet into the incinerating depths of Mount Doom. By inadvertently causing the obliteration of the cursed item, the antagonist unwittingly orchestrates the downfall of the supreme evil, transforming a broken foe into an accidental savior. This breathtaking climax serves as the ultimate illustration of a eucatastrophe, a term famously created by Tolkien for a miraculous, unforeseen pivot that rescues heroes from certain annihilation and delivers overwhelming euphoria. As the mid-20th century ushered in the golden era of comic books, legendary mythological tropes were seamlessly woven into the fabric of modern pop culture. Unlike ancient champions who frequently navigated ambiguous ethical territories despite their legendary status, these new masked crusaders emerged as unyielding beacons of moral purity, while their nemeses were defined not by enhanced abilities, but by a chilling lack of empathy and basic humanity. This stark dichotomy likely blossomed as a psychological response from a global populace utterly exhausted by widespread conflict, severe deprivation, and systemic cruelty. These fictional protectors evolved into undeniable symbols of righteousness conquering malice, offering society much-needed doses of unwavering courage and radiant optimism. Gradually, the sensational plots took a back seat, allowing the intricate psychological profiles of these costumed icons to take center stage in the narrative structure. Within an increasingly secular and highly rationalized society, hungry for moral direction, these vibrant tales address your most profound anxieties and grandest ambitions, providing a sanctuary of unashamed optimism against looming darkness. These paragons stand ready to untangle any dilemma, consistently offering salvation and helping you navigate through crippling existential dread. Yet, as literary eras progressed, adversaries also evolved to possess incredibly nuanced, multifaceted identities, proving that a wonderfully written antagonist can help you decipher the complexities of the human condition just as effectively as the purest hero. The rigid dichotomy dividing virtuous champions from purely wicked antagonists no longer dictates the boundaries of modern storytelling. Contemporary narratives frequently introduce adversaries who elicit genuine sympathy, possessing admirable traits that inexplicably endear them to you despite their profoundly immoral actions. This growing fascination fundamentally challenges traditional ethical paradigms, reflecting a significant shift in our collective psychological landscape during the 21st century. Emerging from this moral ambiguity is the anti-hero, a remarkably complex protagonist who consistently blurs the established lines between heroism and villainy. While fulfilling a central narrative role, this individual typically operates as a cynical misfit or a deeply wounded nonconformist, struggling against rigid societal expectations. Because you have undoubtedly experienced fleeting moments of isolation yourself, it becomes remarkably easy to empathize with an outcast, whose deepest, unspoken motivation is simply a desperate yearning for communal acceptance and love. The renowned Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky brilliantly captured this archetype in his 1866 masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, through the impoverished and tormented student Raskolnikov. Plagued by severe psychological distress and financial ruin, the protagonist convinces himself that divine absence allows him to ascend to a godlike status, granting him the right to shatter moral boundaries without suffering a guilty conscience. After executing his calculated plan to murder an exploitative pawnbroker, he is suddenly forced to eliminate her innocent half-sister, plunging the narrative into a profound exploration of criminal psychology. Subsequently, the devastated protagonist spirals into a feverish delirium, plagued by nightmarish visions, ultimately realizing that his violent actions have irreversibly destroyed a fundamental piece of his own humanity. Today's complex antagonists are frequently defined by distinctive psychological or physical traits, whether that manifests as a hauntingly sinister laugh or a profoundly tragic origin story. The visible scars they carry serve as constant reminders of severe childhood trauma and deep internal fractures, illustrating how a lifetime of relentless suffering can entirely numb a person's emotional capacity. Consequently, these damaged individuals often conclude that manipulating and dominating others is their only viable path toward achieving personal security and ultimate redemption. As you witness their agonizing journey, you are inevitably taken on an intense emotional ride, where initial hatred slowly transitions into genuine compassion, completely absorbing you into the very fabric of the narrative. One of the most iconic manifestations of this phenomenon in popular culture is the Joker, a character who uniquely channels chaotic amusement through a deeply unhinged persona. Exploring his origins has recently diverted public attention away from traditional heroic arcs, particularly highlighted in Alan Moore's influential graphic novel, Batman: The Killing Joke. Before his infamous transformation, the narrative presents him as a failing stand-up comedian who, overwhelmed by his inability to financially support his pregnant wife, desperately agrees to participate in a heist under the guise of the Red Hood. Driven to the absolute brink by unendurable life pressures, he makes a catastrophic choice that violates societal norms, ultimately falling into a vat of toxic chemicals during a terrifying confrontation with Batman. The resulting physical disfigurement, compounded by the heartbreaking accidental death of his spouse, permanently shatters his sanity and births the legendary criminal mastermind. This tragic evolution perfectly illustrates the sad clown paradox, a psychological phenomenon where victims of mistreatment employ comedic expression as a defensive shield to process trauma and repress overwhelming aggression. Confronting his masked adversary, the villain explicitly insists that a single catastrophic day is entirely sufficient to drive even the most rational human being into absolute madness. He forcefully argues that his chaotic mindset mirrors the reality of the world, taunting Batman by pointing out that a profound personal tragedy must have been the catalyst for his vigilante crusade. It is a sobering realization for you as a reader, seeing how the antagonist exposes the fragile illusion of conventional morality and highlights how a desperate human need to pretend that life's relentless struggles make logical sense. Driven by a desire to make a senseless universe comprehensible, the antagonist attempts to reshape society into a grotesque reflection of his own shattered psyche. However, he remains entirely oblivious to the fact that he is actually a distorted mirror of society itself, continuously projecting his profound internal agony onto everyone around him. This dynamic becomes undeniable when he accurately deduces that his nemesis is also driven by the unresolved grief of losing loved ones, a trauma that originally inspired a lifelong vow to eradicate corruption from Gotham City. When offered a final opportunity for rehabilitation to prevent their mutual destruction, the madman flatly refuses, illustrating his incurable despair through a haunting joke about an escaped asylum inmate who absurdly invites a terrified companion to walk across an impossible bridge made of flashlight beams. "Do you take me for a fool? I know you would just switch the beam off while I was suspended mid-air," the second man replies, shaking his head. During this profoundly poignant exchange, Batman and the Joker ultimately bond as they recognize their comparable madness, chuckling at the disastrous certainty of their mutual descent. This highlights the defining characteristic of the Joker: hyper-sanity. Instead of suffering from conventional madness, as many assume, he possesses an amplified perception of existence, an attribute society nonetheless brands as a psychological flaw. He operates with the singular goal of rectifying what he perceives as humanity's profound ignorance regarding existence's ultimate absurdity, completely inverting reality to confront traditional concepts of morality. As the famous saying suggests, you either perish as a valiant champion or survive long enough to witness your own corruption into a nemesis. Antagonists are frequently linked to shadows, exemplified by the Dark Lord Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, the Dark Lord Voldemort within the Harry Potter universe, and Star Wars' Darth Vader, a master of the dark side of the Force. Total annihilation, absolute subjugation, and an endless quest for supremacy are the unifying threads among these wicked figures, reflecting the captivating temptation of malice that can utterly consume a person's psyche. You can view Sauron as the very embodiment of absolute wickedness, serving as the quintessential archetype of malevolence. Although Tolkien rejected the concept of absolute evil, he suggested that this dark entity approached that theoretical limit closer than anything else. Even without a persistent corporeal form, his oppressive weight constantly permeates the realm, a dread perfectly encapsulated by his disembodied, metaphysical I. Conversely, a profound absence of compassion and a lifelong craving for dominance define Voldemort. Conceived through the artificial affection of a love potion and subsequently raised in an institution, his resulting psychological scars likely account for his fundamental inability to experience genuine affection. In contrast, Darth Vader presents a vastly more nuanced portrait of villainy. Formerly the noble Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, his tragic descent is driven by a desperate dread of losing his family, the cunning deceit of Emperor Palpatine, the Dark Lord of the Sith, and a catastrophic, crippling confrontation with his old master, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yielding to these overwhelming pressures, he fully embraces the dark side of the Force. Yet, his profound tragedy culminates in a redemptive sacrifice, sustaining fatal injuries while vanquishing his sinister overlord to protect his child. Parallel to the renowned narrative arc championed by American author Joseph Campbell, there exists a distinct trajectory for the antagonist. Both the valiant and the wicked face monumental catalysts, confront daunting hurdles, rely on loyal accomplices, and navigate a landscape of triumphs and defeats. Typically, the path of malice initiates with a painful alienation from society, inflicting a deep psychological scar. As they navigate their tribulations, the antagonist consistently prioritizes personal gain over communal well-being, embracing ruthlessness and deceit over camaraderie and valor. Ultimately, within the confines of their personal narrative, the evildoer genuinely believes they are the righteous protagonist. By endangering the protagonist's loved ones, the antagonist frequently accelerates the hero's willingness to embrace their destined quest. This aggression shatters any reluctance to abandon the familiarity of the ordinary world, propelling them into a special world fraught with perilous hazards and trials that measure their true worth. Consequently, the nemesis embodies not merely an external physical threat, but also mirrors the internal darkness lurking deep within the champion's own unconscious mind. By battling this adversary, the protagonist is fundamentally conquering their most profound, hidden terrors. Ultimately, the villain provides the essential catalyst for a profound psychological metamorphosis, forcing the hero to undergo a metaphorical demise and resurrection that yields profound revelations about humanity and existence. Our highest moral principles and deepest moral failings are perfectly personified by the duality of these opposing figures. Consider how Superman dedicates his immense extraterrestrial power to humanity's salvation, whereas Lex Luthor channels his vast intellect and fortune into pure, egotistical ambition. Similarly, Sherlock Holmes applies his brilliant deductive mind to untangle intricate mysteries, while Moriarty leverages his own brilliance to architect vast criminal syndicates. And just as Luke Skywalker harnesses the Force to safeguard the cosmos, Darth Vader manipulates it to subjugate entire star systems. Beyond serving as mere literary embodiments of righteousness and depravity, they function as fundamental archetypes, ingrained behavioral templates residing deep within our collective unconscious, forged by the endless repetition of human history. From a psychological standpoint, the antagonist isn't merely an obstacle to be destroyed, but a vital component of the protagonist's own identity, as neither can truly exist without their counterpart. Beneath their intense mutual hatred, both instinctively recognize that this very rivalry infuses their lives with profound meaning. Embracing the concept of otherness, the fundamental nature of being alien or divergent, is crucial for psychological wholeness. You must simultaneously reconcile your own identity with this external entity, a process that ultimately reveals the terrifying monster as a reflection of your own hidden self. Should a champion build their entire existence around destroying their nemesis, the eventual execution of that enemy often triggers a profound existential crisis, leaving the victor drowning in a devastating sense of emptiness and fractured identity. Consequently, a champion often falters at the decisive moment of execution, completely contradicting their previous murderous intent. Ultimately, the protagonist's deepest yearning is not to annihilate their foe, but to witness their redemption. thereby successfully absorbing the antagonistic archetype. You must understand that every individual harbors the latent capacity for both profound nobility and terrible wickedness. The exact same crucibles and hardships forge both the savior and the tyrant, as they walk remarkably similar paths. The defining divergence between the two ultimately boils down to a single choice: the altruism of the righteous versus the egoism of the corrupt. You can see this dynamic perfectly illustrated during a pivotal exchange between Palpatine and Anakin in the third installment of the Star Wars saga. The Supreme Chancellor argues that Sith and Jedi share an identical craving for supreme authority, while the young Jedi counters that Sith are consumed by inward-looking passion, unlike the profoundly selfless defenders of peace. Ultimately, this dichotomy boils down to how an individual responds to alluring corruption. Champions fiercely resist it, whereas antagonists gleefully surrender to its pull. This ancient whisper of seduction has echoed throughout human history, famously symbolized by the deceptive serpent lurking within the Garden of Eden. An antagonist typically suffers trauma inflicted by society and violently retaliates, thereby guaranteeing an endless loop of misery and destruction. They often adopt a nihilistic philosophy, deciding that a flawed universe deserves nothing short of absolute annihilation. Much like a shattered looking glass, reflecting a fractured reality, individuals harboring deep psychological damage perceive their entire environment through a lens of catastrophic devastation. Conversely, a true champion endures similar worldly abuse, but refuses to inflict that anguish upon anyone else. Instead, they actively transmute their personal trauma into a source of communal restoration, ultimately emerging as a profoundly empathetic, wounded healer. The magical universe of Harry Potter highlights this beautifully, presenting both Harry and Voldemort as isolated children, starved of warmth, both desperately yearning for validation and a sense of belonging. Despite sharing these identical foundational traumas, they navigated their suffering through diametrically opposed psychological pathways, eventually morphing into ultimate adversaries. After all, every chess match requires a player to command the dark pieces, reinforcing the idea that genuine liberty lies entirely in our reaction to our circumstances. We lack the power to alter the initial hand fate deals us, but we retain absolute control over how we choose to play those specific cards. Furthermore, our environment is frequently plagued by profound injustices, suggesting that malicious individuals are rarely born wicked. Rather, they are systematically sculpted by the insidious influence of a decaying, toxic society. This systemic corruption explains why you might occasionally harbor a secret fascination with these dark figures, recognizing them as archetypal rebels, boldly defying oppressive hierarchies and shattering hypocritical social conventions. Many of these individuals initially operated as idealistic citizens before becoming completely disillusioned by institutional rot, forcing them to function as rogue outlaws, navigating the twilight of morality. Consequently, cultivating a deep understanding of their underlying psychological drivers proves far more enlightening than merely condemning their surface-level transgressions. By mentally stepping into their position, you can begin to comprehend the severe emotional agonies that ultimately drove them to execute such horrific atrocities. Indeed, the pathway to redemption for any malevolent entity invariably traces back to a traumatic origin, frequently revealing a terrified, profoundly isolated human being struggling with immense psychological pain. Perceiving existence entirely through a filter of suffering transforms the entire world into a hostile landscape filled with potential adversaries. Antagonists serve a crucial psychological function here, forcing us to scrutinize our own minds and genuinely question how we might have behaved under identical pressures. Even when accounting for toxic external influences, your most formidable opponent remains your own internal darkness, presenting an insurmountable barrier until you achieve absolute self-mastery through rigorous introspection. As classical wisdom suggests, comprehending both your own nature and that of your adversary guarantees security across countless conflicts. Ultimately, these dark characters act as polished mirrors, reflecting humanity's most grotesque traits: unbridled greed, extreme selfishness, and pure malice, which perfectly explains our terrifying obsession with their narratives. We are captivated precisely because these figures manifest the repressed elements of our own subconscious, allowing us the comforting illusion of projecting our inherent wickedness onto external targets rather than confronting it within. Such tribalistic finger-pointing remains a gross oversimplification, completely ignoring the psychological reality that every single person harbors a complex mixture of both noble and malevolent impulses. The esteemed Russian author, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, famously observed that the boundary separating virtue from wickedness neatly dissects the core of every individual, posing the profound question of who would dare annihilate a fragment of their own soul. Malevolence defies permanent eradication, simply because it constitutes an inescapable, intrinsic component of the universal human condition. Embracing this duality is essential for authentic existence, whereas clinging to moral absolutes strips away our fundamental humanity. We possess equal capacities for horror, yet the majority actively suppress those urges. The quintessential antagonist, however, represents a terrifying fusion of unchecked egotism and absolute moral blindness. Just as a flawless, purely virtuous protagonist fails to capture the messy reality of genuine human experience. Our ultimate psychological imperative requires us to skillfully harmonize these competing forces deeply embedded within our own psyche. The literary masterpiece, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, brilliantly illuminates this internal conflict by physically manifesting the fractured duality existing within a single consciousness. It serves as a chilling reminder that individuals projecting an aura of impeccable morality frequently conceal terrifying depths of depravity beneath their carefully constructed social facades. The esteemed doctor spent his entire existence aggressively burying his socially unacceptable desires, eventually brewing a chemical concoction to permanently purge this latent darkness from his spirit. Tragically, this desperate experiment birthed Mr. Hyde, a terrifyingly pure incarnation of his most sinister impulses that rapidly overpowered the doctor's original personality. This grotesque alter ego perfectly embodies the universal shadow archetype residing within us all, accurately declaring that his inherent wickedness perfectly matches the darkness hidden inside any ordinary person. While this specific character illustrates the localized, personal manifestation of our repressed urges, the concept of unadulterated, absolute malevolence finds its ultimate expression in the mythological figure of the devil, symbolizing humanity's collective shadow. The renowned Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung observed that engaging in a moderate amount of self-reflection allows you to recognize your personal shadow. Yet confronting absolute malevolence remains an exceptionally rare and devastating psychological ordeal. By successfully absorbing those hidden, darker fragments of your own psyche, you can effectively shield yourself from being consumed by the broader, collective darkness of society. You must exercise profound caution on this journey, however, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously warned in his work Beyond Good and Evil, that battling monstrosities carries the inherent risk of becoming one yourself, and peering relentlessly into the void inevitably invites the void to peer right back. Ultimately, wherever illumination exists, darkness must inevitably follow, guaranteeing that every protagonist is shadowed by a corresponding antagonist. This concept assumes a tangible form in Ursula K. Le Guin's novel A Wizard of Earthsea, wherein the youthful sorcerer Ged is forced to battle a sinister entity he inadvertently unleashed upon reality, a direct manifestation of his own untamed malice. Following an initial brutal encounter that leaves him permanently disfigured, much like the infamous mark left upon Harry Potter by Voldemort. The protagonist's injury throbs painfully whenever his dark counterpart approaches. Although the young mage initially spends the majority of his journey desperately fleeing this dark manifestation rather than seeking to understand it, he ultimately embraces the entity as a fundamental fragment of his own being. Through this courageous act of acceptance, he fuses with the apparition and achieves true psychological wholeness, serving as a brilliant literary illustration of how acknowledging one's shadow represents the crucial primary phase of individuation and emotional maturity. Few narrative resolutions provide as much profound gratification as witnessing the redemption of an antagonist, a deeply wounded individual who inflicts pain upon the world, yet ultimately experiences a profound moral awakening and transforms into a force for good. Such character arcs function as far more than mere entertaining plot mechanisms. They actively demonstrate the extraordinary capacity for profound change residing within you, illustrating the sheer magnitude of human potential. To accomplish their nefarious objectives, these malevolent figures typically project a highly charismatic facade before revealing their true, abhorrent nature, skillfully reflecting society's most desired traits to effortlessly manipulate those around them. To truly comprehend the complex psychological architecture of such individuals, you must delve deep into the widely recognized Dark Triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The first of these traits derives its moniker directly from Narcissus, the legendary figure of Greek mythology, who became tragically obsessed with his own reflection after glimpsing it in a tranquil pool. In modern psychological terms, narcissism manifests as a severe personality disturbance, characterized by a vastly inflated perception of personal significance and a relentless obsession with visions of absolute grandeur. Individuals afflicted by this disorder inherently believe they stand far above the rest of humanity, consistently magnifying their own capabilities while demanding an endless supply of external validation and adoration. Consequently, they respond with intense hostility to even the mildest critique, navigating the world with profound arrogance and an almost total absence of genuine empathy for the struggles of others. Moving to the second pillar, a Machiavellian individual relies almost entirely on cunning, deceitful strategies to seize control, making masterful psychological manipulation the absolute core of their identity. This specific behavioral pattern borrows its title from Niccolò Machiavelli, an infamous historical figure renowned for his ruthless political manifesto, The Prince, which controversially argued that acquiring magnificent state power thoroughly justifies committing profoundly immoral acts. Those exhibiting this psychological profile are defined not solely by their deceptive tactics, but also by their chilling apathy toward ethical boundaries and a hyper-focused, strategic pursuit of their own selfish ambitions. According to the foundational philosophy of this historical thinker, a truly effective sovereign must completely abandon the pursuit of righteousness and equity, choosing instead to prioritize the absolute maintenance of complete authority above all else. From this ruthless perspective, true justice is simply defined by the most formidable individual successfully imposing their unyielding desires upon the subjugated masses. The philosopher famously asserted that while a leader might ideally wish to inspire both affection and terror, it is fundamentally more secure to cultivate fear if forced to choose between the two. Crucially, however, you must ensure that this fear never ferments into outright hatred, as incurring the deep-seated wrath of the populace inevitably triggers violent uprisings, resulting in the catastrophic loss of supremacy or even death. Therefore, the strategic mastermind advises projecting an impeccable public illusion of benevolence and virtue, while simultaneously orchestrating relentless betrayals, complex conspiracies, and merciless deceptions safely out of the public eye. In contemporary society, the closest living embodiment of the quintessential antagonist is arguably the psychopathic criminal, representing the final and most recently classified component of this dark psychological trio. Psychopathy distinguishes itself through a volatile combination of extreme impulsivity and an insatiable craving for stimulation, paired simultaneously with an absolute deficit of both anxiety and compassionate understanding. Because they exist in an emotional freezing point, devoid of genuine affection or authentic camaraderie, these individuals are defined by their fiercely antisocial habits, pure egocentrism, and a chilling inability to experience remorse. Although originating from completely distinct theoretical backgrounds, all three dimensions of the Dark Triad converge significantly, universally producing a socially destructive persona driven by aggressive self-advancement, chronic deceitfulness, and profound emotional detachment. Having explored these underlying psychological frameworks, you can now begin to examine the most prevalent archetypal manifestations of villainy, starting with the universally recognized figure of the Tyrant. This oppressive authoritarian commander is consumed by an endless, unquenchable obsession for dominance, a psychological void that remains permanently starved, regardless of how much supreme authority is ultimately acquired. Manifesting readily in the form of brutal dictators, charismatic cult leaders, and deeply corrupted politicians, this despotic figure operates as the absolute antithesis of a compassionate guide, viewing their loyal subjects as entirely expendable resources. Driven by a ruthless determination to conquer, the tyrant excels at pure goal execution, possessing the remarkable capacity to slice through complex dilemmas in mere minutes and obliterate any opposition standing in their path. Unfortunately for the despot, this intense, laser-like focus frequently mutates into severe inflexibility, blinding them entirely to the reality of a definitively lost cause. They may stubbornly persist in waging a conflict long after the decisive engagement has concluded, ensuring that their penchant for making rapid, unexamined decisions ultimately orchestrates their own catastrophic ruin. Furthermore, this merciless overlord possesses absolutely no capacity to sympathize with the profound sufferings of everyday people, becoming fiercely agitated whenever subordinate decisions deviate from their exact, rigid expectations. Ultimately, because their entire psychological foundation rests upon a fragile sense of supreme superiority, inflicting even a minor wound upon their monumental pride can instantly trigger highly erratic and entirely irrational retaliation. Operating under the guise of immense pride, the tyrant essentially conceals a profound self-hatred, functioning on the harsh belief that failing to reach his goals warrants severe punishment. A hidden terror of losing his grip on authority continually drives him, a dread that frequently translates into an obsessive need to dominate every single person in his vicinity. Ultimately, this relentless pursuit of absolute dominance serves as a psychological shield, compensating for deeply ingrained feelings of inadequacy. While encountering setbacks is an unavoidable aspect of your existence, the way individuals respond varies drastically. Whereas the noble protagonist embraces defeat with grace, the despotic figure violently resists it. True self-compassion requires a foundation of modesty, and absent this grounding, a person rapidly descends into pure hubris. Because the oppressor actively rejects the concept of placing others before himself, a core trait defining any true champion, he inevitably solidifies his own authoritarian nature. As the esteemed scholar Joseph Campbell famously noted, the hero of yesterday becomes the tyrant of tomorrow, unless he crucifies himself today. Alternatively, you might encounter the resentful one, an antagonist entirely consumed by bitter indignation and an unquenchable thirst for retaliation against perceived wrongs. This archetype frequently originates as the overlooked older sibling, watching with intense envy as parental adoration is continually lavished upon a favored brother or sister, prompting dark plots to forcibly prove their own superior value. Positioned as the marginalized outcast, While the golden child naturally attracts all the praise and fortune, this neglected individual internalizes a deep sense of injustice. Such toxic dynamics often stem from a cycle of intergenerational trauma, where toxic household environments and a severe deficit of nurturing guidance actively cultivate the growth of malicious inclinations. Emerging from a background tainted by emotional starvation, physical mistreatment, or outright abandonment, this bitter adversary typically harbors severe psychological wounds or a potent negative complex. Whether sparked by the tragic passing of someone cherished or a devastating breach of trust, these profound psychological injuries generate a volatile mixture of unaddressed fury and a craving for vengeance. Consequently, their descent into malice functions merely as a release valve for this buried psychological pain, allowing them to project their chaotic internal suffering directly onto the society surrounding them. Defiantly broadcasting his opposition to an unjust universe, this particular rogue stands as a fiercely autonomous and daring figure, unshakable in his distorted personal code. He harbors past slights with astonishing clarity, clutching his grievances like badges of honor in a frantic bid to assert his significance against a society he believes discarded him. Despite presenting a hardened, cruel exterior coupled with cunning, practical intelligence, his undeniable magnetism is frequently undermined by fatal flaws, specifically his unpredictable temper, deeply entrenched cynicism, and an overwhelming, corrosive envy. Functioning as a master of deceit, the traitor represents a highly Machiavellian threat who specifically targets those who offer him their unwavering faith. Masked behind encouraging grins and feigned patience, this conspirator meticulously orchestrates the downfall of his closest allies while remaining entirely above suspicion. By masterfully simulating genuine empathy and manufacturing artificial connections, he leverages the absolute confidence of his peers as his most lethal weapon. Ultimately, however, his treacherous lifestyle renders him uniquely susceptible to crushing isolation, intense bouts of paranoia, and a chaotic internal battle with lingering guilt. Occasionally, the role of the antagonist is filled by a trusted guide, who eventually double-crosses their protégé. Within the framework of Norse mythology, the dwarven smith Regin takes in the young Sigurd, aiding the future champion in mending his shattered blade and urging him to slaughter the fearsome beast, Fafnir. Yet, upon the monster's demise, the young warrior discovers his guardian's true, avaricious plot to murder him and claim the spoils. This classic narrative clearly demonstrates that you must maintain a healthy skepticism regarding your instructors, as blindly adhering to a teacher's guidance without evaluating their underlying intentions can prove fatal. Arguably the most abhorrent of all adversaries is the sadist, an entity who derives genuine entertainment and satisfaction purely from witnessing the mental or physical agony of any living creature. Relying heavily on brutality and hostile force to establish dominance, this predator actively relishes manufacturing scenarios that flood their victims with sheer terror or profound embarrassment. Whether they are publicly degrading a subordinate, mercilessly abusing those trapped beneath their authority, or fabricating malicious falsehoods solely to cause distress, their entire existence revolves around the deliberate orchestration of suffering. Continuously eager to flaunt an unmatched intellect, the criminal mastermind harbors deep disdain for anyone lacking his cognitive prowess, a category that unfortunately encompasses virtually the entire human race. Possessing a highly strategic mind that abhors impulsive action, he meticulously constructs convoluted labyrinths and lethal trials, ensuring the outcome is always manipulated to guarantee his victory. His primary psychological drive is a desperate compulsion to validate his own supreme brilliance and to unequivocally demonstrate the incompetence of the masses. Often, this insatiable need for intellectual supremacy is born from years of enduring mockery from peers, or experiencing a profound lack of professional recognition for his extraordinary talents. Countless notorious murderers exhibit these exact traits, deriving immense psychological stimulation from outsmarting law enforcement and executing flawless homicides. A phenomenon historically exemplified by the elusive Jack the Ripper. Similarly, the legendary antagonist of Sherlock Holmes, Professor James Moriarty, epitomizes this archetype by outsourcing the actual violence. He leverages his vast intellect to supply the underworld with tactical blueprints and legal evasion tactics for a substantial price. A further prime example of this terrifying intellect is Hannibal Lecter from the film Silence of the Lambs. Operating as an exceptionally gifted psychiatrist, he masks his horrific, flesh-eating compulsions behind an incredibly sophisticated facade, boasting impeccable manners and an elite appreciation for fine culture. Sharing a comparable level of intellectual brilliance with the criminal strategist is the mad scientist, though this particular archetype operates under a distinctly different set of motivations. Propelled by an insatiable hunger for discovery and empirical testing, this obsessive researcher routinely disregards all moral constraints and remains willfully blind to the catastrophic fallout of his inquiries. Whether he is engineering apocalyptic machinery or accidentally birthing horrors that ultimately leave him paralyzed with fear, his unchecked ambition frequently leads to ruin, as perfectly illustrated in the classic tale of Frankenstein. Thriving on disruption and mischief, the jester or trickster archetype embodies pure chaos. A prime example is Loki from Norse mythology, whose legendary deceit is amplified by his remarkable shape-shifting prowess. Through these cunning transformations, he orchestrates the demise of Balder, the most cherished deity, ultimately setting the stage for Ragnarok, the catastrophic collapse of the divine order and the annihilation of the universe. Fairy tales frequently cast stepmothers and witches in the role of the antagonist, perfectly illustrating the terrible or devouring mother archetype found in stories like Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, Snow White, and Rapunzel. Greek mythology echoes this dark figure through Medea, who infamously murders her own offspring to exact vengeance upon her spouse. Standing in stark contrast to a protective maternal figure, this antagonist is defined by her cruelty, greed, and an unapologetic hunger for dominance, entirely devoid of human compassion. Another deeply enduring antagonistic figure is the femme fatale, a term translating directly to deadly woman. Much like a black widow drawing prey into its fatal web, or the alluring Lorelei of German myth enchanting sailors to their doom with an irresistible melody, she relies entirely on lethal seduction. Driven by vanity and a need for fleeting validation, this archetype relentlessly pursues an idealized lover, callously ignoring any heroic virtues, in favor of superficial thrills that momentarily mask her own emptiness. The moment boredom sets in, she unhesitatingly abandons her current conquest to ensnare someone new. You can see this destructive pattern clearly in the Old Testament, where Delilah beguiles Samson into revealing his vulnerability, ultimately severing his hair and engineering his catastrophic ruin. Salome provides another chilling example. Utilizing an enchanting dance to secure a royal favor, she ruthlessly demands the severed head of John the Baptist, proving that the femme fatale will weaponize charm and manipulation to fulfill her darkest desires. Although you should certainly refrain from absolving antagonists of their transgressions, completely turning a blind eye to them is equally misguided. Instead, it is essential to examine these dark figures alongside our cherished heroes, recognizing them not merely as opposing forces, but as inseparable halves of a singular entity. In this dynamic, the villain embodies the vital yin, serving as an indispensable equilibrium to the heroic yang. True completeness can only be attained when you manage to unite these seemingly contradictory forces. Because the villain archetype gives voice to our deepest shadow, engaging with it often provides a profound therapeutic release. Redeeming the internal antagonist requires you to fully integrate this shadow self, a crucial initial phase on the path to self-realization, which beautifully explains why narratives of a reformed villain resonate so deeply, reflecting our own profound capacity for ultimate harmony. Clinging to an illusion of pure virtue while denying your inherent capacity for malice will, as Solzhenitsyn eloquently observed, ultimately fracture your very soul. Constructing a worldview around the endless pursuit of flawlessness means anchoring your existence in fundamental deceit. However, the moment you embrace your inherent imperfections and welcome both the light and the darkness of existence, you finally unlock the complete human experience and step into genuine wholeness.